My name is Sarah, and like many girls from small towns, I had big dreams. I grew up in a place where everyone knew everyone's business. My life was simple, safe, and very controlled. My parents were strict, and my world was limited to the walls of my school and the local library. But then, I got my acceptance letter from a prestigious university in the big city. To me, that letter wasn't just about education. It was my golden ticket to freedom. When I first arrived at the university dorms, the air felt different. It smelled like rain, coffee, and endless possibilities. For the first time in my life, nobody was telling me when to come home or who I could talk to. I was 19, curious, and incredibly naive. I thought I was ready for the world, but the truth was, I didn't even know myself yet. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of new faces and loud music. My roommate, Chloe, was the opposite of me. She was bold, wore short skirts, and always knew where the best parties were. Sarah, you can't spend your Friday night reading sociology books, Chloe said one evening as she applied bright red lipstick. You're in the city now. It's time to live a little. There's a party at the frat house tonight and everyone is going. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. I was wearing an oversized sweater and jeans. I looked like the girl I used to be back home. I wanted to be different. I wanted to be the girl that people noticed. So I borrowed one of Chloe's dresses, a black one that felt far too tight and far too short. As we walked toward the party, my heart was pounding against my ribs. The music was so loud I could feel it in the ground. The smell of cheap perfume and alcohol filled the air. This was the world my parents had warned me about, the world they called dangerous. But as I looked at the smiling faces and the glowing lights, it didn't look dangerous. It looked beautiful. It looked like the freedom I had been craving for years. I didn't know that tonight would be the first step on a very long and painful path. I didn't know that living a little would soon turn into losing everything I once valued. And most importantly, I didn't know that among the crowd of strangers, a pair of dark eyes was already watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to introduce himself. His name was Julian, and he was the beginning of my most beautiful disaster. The party was a sea of moving bodies. In my small town, a party usually meant a few friends sitting around a bonfire, but this was a different world entirely. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, sweet vapes, and something else, a heavy, intoxicating energy that made my head spin. For a moment I stood frozen at the entrance, feeling like an intruder in a place where everyone else knew the rules but me. "Stop standing there like a statue, Sarah," Chloe shouted over the thumping bass of the music. She grabbed my hand and led me toward a large table filled with red plastic cups. "Drink this. It will help you relax." I hesitated. My father's voice echoed in my mind, warning me about the dangers of losing control. But I looked around at the other girls. They seemed so confident, so free. I didn't want to be the good girl anymore. I took a sip, then a gulp. The liquid burned my throat, but it brought a sudden warmth to my chest that made the loud music feel less threatening. As the night went on, the room began to blur in a way that felt strangely pleasant. I found myself laughing louder than I ever had. I was talking to people whose names I wouldn't remember the next morning, feeling a sense of belonging that I had never known. For the first time, I wasn't Sarah the librarian's daughter. I was just Sarah, a girl in a black dress in the middle of a big city. Then, I saw him. He was sitting on a leather sofa in the corner of the room, surrounded by people, yet he seemed completely apart from them. He wasn't dancing or shouting. He was just watching. When his eyes caught mine, I felt a jolt of electricity run through my body. It wasn't just that he was handsome. He had an intensity in his gaze that made me feel like he could see right through my borrowed dress and my fake confidence. "That's Julian," Chloe whispered in my ear, noticing where I was looking. "He's a senior, architecture student. He's brilliant, but Be careful, Sarah. He's the kind of guy your mother warned you about. Instead of feeling afraid, I felt a dangerous pull. Julian stood up and began walking toward me. Every step he took made my heart beat faster. When he finally stood in front of me, he didn't say hello or ask for my name. "You look like you're trying very hard to pretend you've done this before," he said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that cut through the noise of the party. I felt a flash of embarrassment. "Is it that obvious?" He smiled, a slow, predatory tilt of his lips. "It's charming. The city hasn't ruined you yet." He reached out and tucked a stray hair behind my ear. His touch was cold, but it sent a fire through my skin. "I'm Julian, and I think you're the most interesting thing in this room." In that moment, under the flickering neon lights, I felt chosen. I felt special. I didn't realize that Julian was an expert at finding girls like me, girls who were hungry for a life they didn't understand. He didn't just offer me a conversation, he offered me an escape. And I, blinded by the thrill of my own rebellion, took his hand without a second thought. "It's too loud in here," Julian said, his eyes never leaving mine. "I know a place where we can actually hear ourselves think. Do you trust me, Sarah?" Logic told me to say no. I had just met this man, and everything about him screamed danger, just as Chloe had warned. But the drink in my hand and the newfound freedom in my heart whispered a different answer. I nodded, and he led me through the crowd, his hand firmly gripping mine. We climbed a narrow set of stairs that led to a small balcony overlooking the university campus and the city lights beyond. The air out here was crisp and cold, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the party below. The city looked like a fallen galaxy, with thousands of yellow and white lights shimmering in the dark. For a moment we stood in silence. "You're from a small town, aren't you?" Julian asked, leaning against the railing. He lit a cigarette, the small orange flame illuminating the sharp angles of his face. "How did you know?" I asked, feeling exposed. "You have that look. The look of someone who has spent their whole life staring at the same four walls and is finally seeing the horizon. It's a beautiful look, but it's also dangerous. It makes you vulnerable." I looked out at the city, feeling a lump in my throat. I just wanted to be free, Julian. I spent 18 years being the perfect daughter, the perfect student. I'm tired of being perfect. Julian stepped closer, so close I could smell the faint scent of tobacco and expensive wood on his coat. "Being perfect is boring, Sarah. But freedom has a price. Most people aren't willing to pay it. They want the thrill without the fall." He reached out and traced the line of my jaw with his thumb. "Are you willing to pay the price?" I didn't fully understand what he meant then. I thought he was talking about staying out late or skipping a few classes. I didn't know he was talking about the slow destruction of the person I used to be. I looked up at him, my breath hitching in my chest. "I think I am." He leaned down, his lips inches from mine. "Good," he whispered, "because I think we're going to have a lot of fun together, Sarah." As the party continued to roar beneath us, I felt a strange sense of fate. I felt as though my old life was a skin I was finally shedding. I didn't realize that once that skin was gone, I would be left raw and unprotected. That night, as the first Bab one came to an end, I didn't go back to my dorm until the sun began to peek over the skyscrapers. I walked home with Julian's phone number in my pocket and a fire in my soul that I mistook for love. I was Sarah, the girl who was no longer afraid. Or so I thought. The days following that first party felt like a dream. The university lectures, which I had once been so excited about, suddenly seemed dull and grey. My mind wasn't on sociology or history, it was on the vibration of my phone in my pocket. Every time a message from Julian popped up, my heart would skip a beat. He didn't text like other boys. He didn't ask how my day was. He would simply send a location and a time. "Meet me at the Neon Crow at 11 p.m., one message read. I knew the Neon Crow was a club known for its dark corners and loud, pounding music. a place my parents would describe as a den of sin. But when Julian asked, I didn't see the danger. I saw an invitation to be someone important. I started skipping my morning classes. It began with just one Monday morning because I was too tired from staying out late with him. Then it became 2. By the 3rd week, I had missed an entire module of my course. My roommate, Chloe, who was usually the life of the party, began to look at me with concern. Sarah, you're changing, she said one afternoon while I was getting ready for another night out. You haven't opened a textbook in weeks. And Julian? He's a lot, Sarah. He's taking up all your space. You're just jealous, Chloe, I snapped, throwing a dress into my bag. I didn't like the truth in her eyes, so I chose to be angry instead. You were the one who told me to live a little. Now that I am, you're acting like my mother. That was the first time I felt a wall building between me and the people who actually cared about me. I was trading my old friendships for a man I barely knew, but whose touch made me feel like I was flying. That night at the club, the music was a physical force. Julian was waiting for me at a private table. He had a bottle of expensive vodka and a group of friends who looked at me like I was a new toy. They were older, wealthier, and far more experienced in the ways of the world. There she is, Julian said, pulling me down to sit beside him. He kissed my temple, but his eyes remained on his friends. The girl who's learning that there's more to life than books. One of his friends, a guy with a cold smile named Marcus, pushed a small glass toward me. To freedom, Sarah. In this city, you can be whoever you want to be. No rules, no limits. I looked at the glass, then at Julian. He was watching me, a silent challenge in his eyes. He wanted to see if I was brave enough to keep up with his world. I picked up the glass and drank. In that moment, I felt a strange sense of pride. I thought I was becoming sophisticated. I didn't realize I was just becoming easy to manipulate. As the night progressed, the lines between right and wrong began to blur. The music, the lights, and the way Julian's hand stayed possessively on my waist made me feel invincible. I felt like I was finally at the center of the world, unaware that I was actually standing on the edge of a very deep hole. It was nearly 3 in the morning when we left the club. The city was quiet, but my head was still screaming with the echoes of the bass. Julian didn't call a taxi for me to go back to my dorm. Instead, he led me toward his car, a sleek, dark vehicle that looked like a shadow under the streetlights. You're not going back to that tiny room tonight, Sarah, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a command. And in my dazed state, I found I didn't want to go back. I wanted to stay in this bubble of excitement he had created for me. His apartment was located in a high-rise building that overlooked the river. It was minimalist, cold, and smelled of expensive leather and old smoke. Everything about it was intimidating, yet I felt a desperate need to fit in. I wanted Julian to look at me and see someone who belonged in his world, not a provincial girl who was afraid of her own shadow. Do you want another drink? He asked, throwing his keys on the marble counter. No, I think I've had enough, I whispered, suddenly feeling very small in the large, silent room. Julian walked over to me. He stood so close that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. He tilted my chin up, forcing me to look into his dark, unreadable eyes. You're so quiet now, Sarah. Are you thinking about your father? Or your sociology professor? He laughed, a soft, mocking sound. They don't understand you. They want to keep you in a cage. But I want to see you fly. That night, the lines I had drawn for myself my entire life, the promises I had made to my mother, the values I had been raised with, simply vanished. I thought that by giving him everything, I was proving my love. I thought that by crossing that final boundary, I was becoming an adult. But as I lay awake later that night, watching the moonlight hit the ceiling of his cold apartment, I didn't feel like an adult. I felt hollow. I looked at Julian, who was sleeping peacefully beside me, and for a split second I felt a flash of terror. I realized I didn't actually know this man. I didn't know his middle name, his favorite color, or what he dreamed about. I only knew how he made me feel when he looked at me. The next morning, I missed my midterm exam. My phone was filled with missed calls from my parents and worried texts from Chloe. But as I sat on Julian's balcony, drinking coffee and wearing his oversized shirt, I pushed the guilt away. I told myself that this was the price of freedom he had mentioned. I told myself that I was special because a man like Julian chose me. I didn't realize that for Julian I wasn't a partner. I was an experiment. I was a project. He was teaching me how to break my own heart, and I was a very fast learner. Every time I felt a spark of doubt, I would suppress it with another night out, another drink, and another lie to the people who loved me. My life was becoming a beautiful, dangerous lie, and I was falling deeper into the darkness every single day. By the second month of university, I was a ghost. I attended just enough classes to keep the administration from calling my parents, but my mind was always elsewhere. My skin had become pale from the lack of sleep, and the spark in my eyes had been replaced by a constant, nervous energy. I was no longer the girl from the small town. I was a shadow of the city's nightlife. One Friday evening, Julian took me to a private party in a warehouse district. This wasn't like the college parties I had seen before. There were no plastic cups here. Instead, there were crystal glasses, expensive silk sofas in the middle of a concrete room, and a smell that was sweet and chemical. "This is the real city, Sarah," Julian whispered in my ear. He held a small silver box in his hand. "The people here, they don't follow rules. They make them." I looked around. I saw people I recognized from the news, the children of wealthy politicians and famous artists. They were all laughing, but their laughter sounded empty. It was then that I saw Marcus again, the friend with the cold eyes. He was sitting with two girls who looked like they stepped off a fashion runway. They were passing around a small glass pipe. "Try it, Sarah," Marcus said, his voice flat. "It makes the music sound like colours. It makes the world stop hurting." I looked at Julian. I wanted him to protect me. I wanted him to say, "No, she doesn't do that." But instead, he just watched me with that same challenging gaze. "Don't be a child, Sarah," Julian said softly. "You said you wanted to be free. Freedom means choosing your own poisons." At that moment, I felt a cold shiver down my spine. I realized that my freedom was actually a trap. But I was so desperate for Julian's approval, so terrified that he would think I was boring, that I reached out. I took a breath of the sweet smoke. Suddenly, the room began to tilt. The music turned into a kaleidoscope of sound that vibrated in my teeth. I felt like I was floating, but at the same time, I felt like I was falling from a great height. I looked at Julian, and for a second, his face distorted into a mask of something cruel. I tried to speak, but my voice was gone. "There she is," Marcus laughed. "Welcome to the deep end, Sarah." That night, I didn't just lose my sobriety. I lost my sense of safety. I was surrounded by people, yet I had never felt more alone. I realized that in this world, nobody was looking out for anyone else. Julian wasn't my protector. He was my guide into a labyrinth with no exit. As I danced under the flickering strobe lights, I felt my old self, the girl who loved books and dreamed of sociology, dying a little more with every heartbeat. The party lasted until the sun was high in the sky. When we finally left, the morning light felt like needles in my eyes. I felt sick, my head was throbbing, and I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. Julian, however, looked perfectly fine. He was whistling a tune as he unlocked his car. "Julian, I don't feel good," I whispered, leaning against the cold brick wall of the warehouse. He didn't look at me. "You'll be fine, Sarah. It's just the come down. You need to learn how to handle your fun." "But what if my parents call? What if I fail my exam on Monday?" I was starting to panic. The reality of my situation was crashing down on me. I was failing my life, and the man I loved didn't seem to care. Julian stopped whistling. He turned to me, his face suddenly cold and hard. "Listen to me. Your parents and your exams are part of your old life. If you want to be with me, you have to grow up. I don't have time for a girl who cries every time she has a headache. He opened the car door for me, but it didn't feel like a polite gesture. It felt like a cage door opening. I got in, silent and defeated. When I got back to the dorm, Chloe was waiting for me. She looked like she hadn't slept either, but for a different reason. There was a letter on my desk. It was a warning from the university. I was on the verge of being expelled. "Sarah, please," Chloe said, her voice trembling. "Talk to me. Look at yourself. You're shaking. This isn't you." I looked in the mirror. My hair was matted, my makeup was smeared across my face like a bruise, and my eyes looked hollow. I looked like the bad girls my mother used to pray for. I wanted to cry, I wanted to hug Chloe and tell her everything. But then I saw a text on my phone from Julian. "I'm coming to pick you up at 8. Wear something beautiful." And just like that, the guilt vanished. The obsession took over again. I looked at Chloe with a coldness that I didn't know I possessed. "Mind your own business, Chloe," I said, my voice sounding like a stranger's. "I'm living my life. You're just too afraid to live yours." I walked into the bathroom and turned on the shower, trying to wash away the smell of the warehouse and the feeling of my own soul breaking. But no matter how much soap I used, I still felt dirty. I was addicted to the chaos, addicted to Julian, and I was moving toward a catastrophe that I could no longer avoid. Money was the first thing that truly started to vanish. Back in my small town, my allowance was something I managed carefully for books and occasional treats. But in Julian's world, money was like water. It flowed constantly and disappeared just as fast. To keep up with him, to wear the clothes his friends wore, and to pay for the entries into the clubs he frequented, I began to drain my savings. One afternoon, my mother called. My heart stopped when I saw her name on the screen. "Sarah, honey," she said, her voice full of warmth and pride. "We just sent the extra money for your textbooks and that biology lab fee you mentioned. Is it enough? Your father is working extra shifts, but we want to make sure you have everything you need to succeed." I stared at the balance on my banking app. The money they had sent last week was already gone. I had spent it on a designer jacket because Julian had remarked that my old coat looked childish. I felt a sharp sting of guilt in my chest, a physical pain that made it hard to breathe. "Yes, Mom," I lied, my voice shaking. "It's perfect. The books are expensive, but they're helping a lot. I'm studying right now." I wasn't studying. I was sitting in a dark cafe, waiting for Julian to pick me up. As I hung up the phone, I felt like a criminal. I was stealing from my parents' hard work to fund a lifestyle that was slowly killing my spirit. But the moment Julian's car pulled up and he gave me that crooked smile, the guilt was pushed into a dark corner of my mind. "You look stressed," Julian said, reaching over to touch my cheek. "Let's go to Marcus's villa. A few days away from the city will do you good." "Julian, I have a project due on Wednesday," I said weakly. He sighed, his hand dropping away. "Always with the schoolwork, Sarah. Do you want to be a boring student, or do you want to live an extraordinary life with me? Marcus's place is where things actually happen. The connections you'll make there are worth more than any degree." I looked at my reflection in the car window. I didn't recognize the girl staring back. She looked older, harder, and deeply lost. But I didn't want to lose Julian. I was terrified that if I said no just once, he would realize I wasn't the free spirit he wanted, and he would replace me with someone who was. So I turned off my phone, effectively silencing my parents and my responsibilities, and I let him drive me away into the night. Marcus's villa was a glass and steel fortress on the outskirts of the city. It was beautiful, but it felt cold, like a museum for people who had too much money and too little soul. The weekend was a blur of expensive wine, strangers, and the constant pressure to be fun. During a party on the second night, I found myself alone in the kitchen with Marcus. He was pouring himself a drink, looking at me with an expression that made me feel like I was under a microscope. "You're very loyal to Julian, aren't you?" Marcus asked, his voice smooth and dangerous. "I love him," I said, trying to sound confident. Marcus laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Love is a strong word for someone who doesn't even know your favorite book. Julian loves an audience, Sarah. He loves people who reflect his own light back at him. Just be careful. When the light goes out, he tends to leave the room." I wanted to defend Julian, to tell Marcus he was wrong, but I remembered the nights I cried silently beside Julian while he slept, feeling miles away. Lies are like a house of cards. They look beautiful until a small wind blows, and then everything falls apart. For me, that wind came on a Tuesday morning in the form of a phone call. Not from Julian, but from the front desk of my dormitory. "Sarah, you have visitors," the receptionist said. My heart nearly stopped. I was lying in bed, the room smelling of stale smoke and Julian's cologne. I hadn't been to a lecture in 10 days. My desk was covered in empty coffee cups and unpaid bills. I rushed to the window and looked down. My breath caught in my throat. Standing by the entrance were my parents. They looked so out of place in the city. My father was wearing his best Sunday shirt, and my mother was clutching a box of home-cooked food she had travelled 4 hours to bring me. They were smiling, looking around at the university buildings with pride, thinking their daughter was inside one of them, becoming a success. I panicked. I threw my messy clothes into the closet, tried to hide the bottles under the bed, and washed my face with cold water to hide the dark circles under my eyes. When I opened the door, my mother let out a cry of joy and hugged me. "Oh, Sarah, you look so thin," she whispered, pulling back to look at my face. Her smile faded slightly. "Are you eating enough? You look tired, honey." "I'm just studying hard, Mom," I lied, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. "Finals are coming up, you know." My father looked around the room. He was a simple man, but he wasn't foolish. He saw the expensive designer shoes in the corner, shoes I could never afford with my allowance. He saw the way I couldn't meet his eyes. "We went to your department first, Sarah. They told us you haven't checked in for your seminars lately. They said they were worried about you." The silence in the room was deafening. I felt like I was suffocating. I opened my mouth to make another excuse, but at that exact moment the door swung open. Julian walked in without knocking. Julian was wearing his usual expensive leather jacket, looking bored and beautiful. He didn't see my parents at first. "Sarah, why haven't you answered my texts? We're going to Marcus's—" He stopped mid-sentence when he realized we weren't alone. He looked at my father's worn shoes and my mother's cheap floral dress with a look of mild disgust that he didn't even try to hide. "Julian," I whispered, my voice trembling. "These are my parents." The air in the room changed. My father stood up straight, his eyes moving from Julian to me. He saw the way I looked at Julian, with a mixture of fear and desperate obsession. He saw the man who had been taking his daughter away. "So, you're the reason," my father said, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't know who you think I am," Julian said, his voice cold and arrogant. "But Sarah is an adult. She makes her own choices. If she'd rather be with me than sitting in a dusty classroom, that's her business." "Julian, please stop," I begged, but Julian didn't stop. He loved the drama. He loved being the center of the conflict. "You people live in a small world. You want to keep her trapped in your little town, living a little life? But she belongs with me now." My mother started to cry. It was the most painful sound I had ever heard. "Sarah, is this true? Is this what you've been doing with the money we sent? Is this why you don't call us?" I looked at Julian. He was waiting for me to choose him. Then I looked at my parents. I saw the years of sacrifice in their tired eyes. I saw the love that Julian would never be able to give me. For a second, I wanted to run to them. But then Julian stepped closer and put a hand on my shoulder. His touch felt like a claim, a mark of ownership. "I think you should leave," I said to my parents, the words barely a whisper. My father looked at me as if I had struck him. He didn't yell. He didn't get angry. He just looked at me with a profound sadness that broke my heart into a million pieces. He took my mother's hand. "We didn't lose you to the city, Sarah," he said quietly. "We lost you to yourself." They left the box of food on my desk and walked out. When the door closed, Julian laughed and sat on my bed. "Well, that was dramatic. Come on, pack your bags. We're late for the party." I stood there, staring at the closed door, feeling like the smallest, most pathetic person in the world. I had chosen a man who didn't even know my favourite colour over the people who had given me life. I felt a coldness settling in my bones that I knew would never go away. I had kept my secrets, but in doing so, I had lost my home. When you lose your anchor, you don't just drift. You get swept away by the storm. After my parents walked out of that room, a part of me died. To deal with the ghost of the girl I used to be, I decided to stop feeling altogether. If I couldn't be the perfect daughter, I would be the perfect shadow in Julian's world. The nights became longer and the fun became more dangerous. We were no longer just going to clubs. We were going to private apartments where the doors were locked from the inside. The air in these places was heavy with the smell of things I didn't want to name. Julian liked me this way, numb, quiet, and always ready to follow. He started introducing me as his little bird. "Look at her," he would say to his friends, blowing smoke into the air. "She used to cry over sociology books. Now, she's finally learning how to live." I started experimenting with things I had once feared. Alcohol wasn't enough anymore to drown out the voice of my father saying, "We lost you to yourself." I needed more. I needed the world to go blurry, to turn into a kaleidoscope of colours and sounds where my guilt couldn't find me. My health began to decline rapidly. I lost so much weight that my collarbones looked like knives under my skin. My hair, which used to be thick and shiny, was now brittle and dull. But in the dark, neon-lit world of Julian's friends, looking broken was considered a fashion statement. They called it heroin chic. I called it slow suicide. One night, at a penthouse party overlooking the dark river, Julian handed me a small blue pill. "This will make the sun come up faster," he whispered, his eyes gleaming with a cold light. I looked at the pill. I knew deep down that this was a line I shouldn't cross. But then I looked at Julian. I saw the way he was looking at a beautiful, confident woman across the room. I felt that familiar poisonous fear. The fear that if I wasn't daring enough, I would lose him. I swallowed it. The hours that followed were a nightmare disguised as a dream. My heart felt like it was trying to escape my chest. I felt invincible, then suddenly I felt like I was made of glass that was about to shatter. I danced until my feet bled, but I couldn't feel the pain. I talked to people who looked like monsters, but I thought they were angels. Suddenly the music stopped. Or perhaps it was just my heart. I felt a coldness spreading from my stomach to my limbs. The lights of the penthouse began to spin faster and faster until they became a single blinding white line. I tried to reach for Julian, but he was across the room, laughing at something Marcus said. He didn't see me gasping for air. He didn't see me falling. I hit the floor with a thud that nobody heard over the bass. As I lay there, staring at the expensive marble ceiling, I realized the most terrifying truth of all. If I died tonight, Julian wouldn't cry. He would just call a taxi and find another little bird to replace me by tomorrow. "Help," I tried to whisper, but only a dry sob came out. I saw shadows moving around me. Someone stepped over my hand as if I were a piece of trash. I felt the darkness closing in, and for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of it. I was tired. I was so tired of being free. Just before I lost consciousness, I saw a face. It wasn't Julian's. It was Chloe's. She wasn't actually there, of course, but the memory of her, the way she used to worry about me, the way she offered me a real home, flashed before my eyes. I realized then that Julian hadn't taught me how to fly. He had only taught me how to fall without screaming. As the world turned black, I had one final thought. I want to go home. Please God, I just want to go home. The first thing I smelled was bleach. It was a sharp, clean scent that felt like a slap in the face. My eyes felt heavy, glued shut by a sleep that didn't feel like rest. When I finally forced them open, the world was painfully white. There were no neon lights, no smoke, and no thumping bass. Just the steady, rhythmic beep, beep, beep of a heart monitor. I was in a hospital. My throat felt like I had swallowed sand. I tried to move my hand, but it felt leaden, attached to a clear tube that was feeding liquid into my veins. I looked to my side, hoping to see a familiar face. I wanted to see Julian. I wanted him to tell me everything was okay, that it was just a bad dream. But the chair beside my bed was empty. A nurse walked in, her face kind but tired. "You're awake," she said softly, checking the monitor. "You're lucky, Sarah. Your friend dropped you off at the emergency entrance and drove away. If the security guard hadn't seen you, you might not have made it." My friend?" I croaked. Was he tall? Dark hair? Did he leave a note? The nurse looked at me with pity, a look I was beginning to hate. "He didn't leave anything, honey. He didn't even give us his name. He just left you on the sidewalk like a bag of laundry." A cold realization washed over me. Julian hadn't stayed. He hadn't held my hand or worried about whether I lived or died. To him, an overdose wasn't a tragedy. It was an inconvenience. It was a mess he didn't want to clean up. I was his little bird when I was singing and dancing, but the moment my wings broke, I was just a liability. I stayed in that hospital bed for 3 days. Julian never called. He never sent a text. It was as if I had never existed in his world. My phone, which I had once checked every minute for his messages, was now silent and broken. Its screen cracked from my fall. On the 4th day, the door to my room opened. I expected the nurse, but instead I saw Chloe. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes, but she was holding a bouquet of yellow flowers. My favourite. "I called every hospital in the city until I found you," she said, her voice trembling as she sat down. "How did you know?" I whispered, tears finally stinging my eyes. "Julian came back to the dorms to get his things from your room," Chloe said, her jaw tightening. "I asked him where you were. He just laughed and said you couldn't handle the lifestyle and that he was moving on. He didn't even tell me you were in the hospital, Sarah." I had to guess. The pain in my chest was worse than the physical illness. Every lie I had told, every sacrifice I had made for him, felt like a mountain of garbage falling on me. I had traded my parents, my education, and my health for a man who didn't even think I was worth a phone call. "I'm so sorry, Chloe," I sobbed, covering my face with my thin, shaking hands. "I'm so, so sorry." Chloe didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't lecture me. She just reached out and held my hand. "It's okay, Sarah. The hospital called your parents. They're on their way. They never stopped loving you, even when you stopped loving yourself." I looked out the window at the grey city sky. I knew the road back would be long and filled with shame. I had lost my scholarship, my money was gone, and my reputation was in ruins. But as I held Chloe's hand, I realized that the first step to healing was seeing the truth. Julian was a ghost, a shadow I had chased into the dark. He was gone, and for the first time in months, I realized that was the best thing that could have happened to me. The hospital released me, but I didn't feel free. Walking out of those sterile white halls felt like walking into a trial where I was the only witness and the judge. My parents were waiting in the parking lot. The ride home was the longest 4 hours of my life. The silence in the car was heavier than any shout or scream could ever be. My father kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, while my mother stared out the window, wiping her eyes every few miles. When we arrived at the small house I had once been so desperate to leave, it felt different. The air was too quiet, and my room felt like a museum of a girl who no longer existed. On my desk was a final letter from the university. It was brief and cold. Because of my grades, my long absence, and the incident at the party, I was officially expelled. My scholarship was gone. My future, which once looked so bright, was now a pile of ashes. "I'm sorry," I whispered over dinner that night. I couldn't even look at the home-cooked food my mother had prepared. "Sorry doesn't pay back the money we saved for 20 years, Sarah," my father said, his voice cracking. "Sorry doesn't fix the fact that you chose a stranger over your own blood. You didn't just break your life, you broke ours too." He stood up and left the table. I sat there, feeling the full weight of my freedom. This was the price Julian had mentioned, but Julian wasn't here to share the cost. He was probably at another party whispering the same lies to another girl who wanted to be interesting. I realized then that I wasn't special to him. I was just a chapter in his book of conquests, while he was the entire tragedy of mine. The weeks that followed were a blur of depression and shame. I didn't leave the house. I couldn't face the neighbours or the people who had once seen me as the smart girl who went to the big city. Every time the phone rang, I jumped, half hoping and half fearing it was Julian. But deep down, I knew he would never call. He didn't want a girl with problems. He wanted a girl with no past and no boundaries. I spent my days. Healing isn't a sudden event. It's a slow, painful crawl. 2 months after returning home, the fog in my mind finally began to clear. The freedom Julian had promised me now felt like a fever dream that had almost cost me my life. But I couldn't just sit in my room and hide forever. I owed my parents more than just an apology. I owed them the money I had wasted and the dignity I had lost. I took a job at the local grocery store, the very place I used to look down upon when I was a sophisticated college student. On my first day, my hands shook as I put on the green apron. I saw people I knew from high school, people who had stayed behind, who were working hard and living simple lives. I saw the whispers and the pitying looks. They knew the smart girl had come back broken. "Forget them, Sarah," I whispered to myself as I stacked cans of soup on the shelves. "You're not here for them. You're here for you." Every cent I earned, I put into an envelope on my father's nightstand. At first, he wouldn't even touch it. He would look at the envelope and then look at me with a cold, distant expression. But I didn't stop. I worked double shifts. I cleaned the floors. I walked home in the rain to save bus fare. Slowly, the physical labour began to change me. The pale, sickly girl in the mirror started to disappear. My strength returned, and with it, a new kind of clarity. I started reading again, not because I had to for a grade, but because I remembered how it felt to lose myself in a story that didn't involve a dark club or a silver lie. I realised that the life Julian had offered me was shallow, a world of mirrors where everyone was too busy looking at themselves to notice anyone else was drowning. One evening, while I was closing the store, a familiar car pulled into the parking lot. My heart stopped. It was a dark, sleek vehicle exactly like Julian's. For a second, a wave of the old obsession washed over me. My breath hitched, and I felt that dangerous familiar pull in my chest. A man stepped out, but it wasn't Julian. It was just a stranger asking for directions. As I watched the car drive away, I didn't feel disappointed. I felt relieved. I realised that the fire I thought I felt for Julian wasn't love. It was an addiction to the drama and the fear. I didn't miss him. I missed the girl I thought I could be with him. But that girl was a lie. That night when I got home, my father was sitting at the kitchen table. The envelope of money was open in front of him. "This is the 3rd month, Sarah," he said, his voice softer than I had heard it in a long time. "It's not enough to pay for the scholarship, Dad." "I know that," I said, looking at my tired, calloused hands. "But it's a start. I'm going to pay back every penny." My father looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time since that day in the city. He saw the green apron, the tired eyes, and the determination. He reached out and placed his hand over mine. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a bridge being rebuilt over a canyon. "The money matters, Sarah," he said quietly. "But seeing you work for it matters more. You're not the girl who left for the city, and you're not the girl who came back in that hospital bed. You're someone new. And I think I'm starting to like this version of you better." I cried that night, but for the first time they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of relief. I was still far from where I wanted to be, and my academic career was still a ruin, but I was no longer a ghost. I was Sarah, and I was finally standing on my own 2 feet. A year had passed since the night my world went black on a cold marble floor. A year of working, a year of silence, and a year of rebuilding. The scars were still there. Sometimes I would pass a certain perfume or hear a specific song and feel a ghost of the old anxiety, but I was no longer afraid of the dark. I had learned that the only way to truly defeat your past is to face it with your head held high. I decided to apply to a small local community college. It wasn't the prestigious university in the city, and there were no grand stone archways or famous professors. But it was a place where I could study what I actually loved: social work. I wanted to help girls who were just like me, girls who felt small, girls who thought that a man's attention was the only way to feel important. The day I received my new acceptance letter, I didn't celebrate at a club. I sat on the porch with my parents, drinking tea and watching the sunset. "We're proud of you, Sarah," my mother said, her eyes shining. This time I knew I had earned those words. I hadn't just gotten into a school, I had gotten back into my own life. A few weeks later, a familiar face appeared at the grocery store. It was Chloe. She had finished her year at the big university and was home for the summer. When she saw me in my apron, she didn't look at me with pity. She ran to me and gave me a hug that nearly knocked me over. "You look amazing, Sarah," she cried. "Your eyes, they're back. The real Sarah is back." We sat in a small park nearby, and she told me about the city. She told me that Marcus had been arrested for fraud, and that Julian had moved on to a new freshman girl, a girl who looked exactly like I did a year ago. "Does it hurt to hear that?" Chloe asked gently. I thought about it for a moment. I pictured Julian's face, his dark eyes, and his mocking smile. "No," I said, and I realized I meant it. "It makes me sad for her, but it doesn't hurt me anymore. He didn't love me, Chloe. He loved the power he had over me, and he doesn't have that power anymore." As I prepare to start my new classes, I often think about the girl I was when I first left for the city. I wish I could go back and tell her that she was already enough. I wish I could tell her that freedom isn't about breaking rules or following a dangerous man into the dark. It's about having the strength to say no to the things that destroy you. My journey wasn't beautiful. It was messy, painful, and filled with shame. I lost my scholarship, I betrayed my parents' trust, and I nearly lost my life. But in the ruins of my mistakes, I found something much more valuable than a degree or a designer jacket. I found my own voice. To anyone listening to my story, be careful with your heart. The city lights are bright, and the promises of living a little can be very tempting. But remember that the people who truly love you will never ask you to lose yourself to prove your love for them. My name is Sarah. I am a survivor, a student, and a daughter. I made a mistake that changed my life, but I didn't let that mistake define me. I am finally walking toward a horizon that is bright, clear, and most importantly, real. And for the first time in my life, I am exactly where I am supposed to be.